Okay, guys, so I know that while we were doing this, many of you may have thought that I forgot about this little part right here, domain and range. But I wanted to save that, and I also want to add in, right here where it says find vertex, I want you to write increasing and decreasing. What we're going to look at is where is the graph increasing, where is the graph decreasing, and we're going to find the domain and the range. Now, let me remind you that domain is all possible x values that the graph can have, okay? All possible x values. Range is all the y values a graph can have, okay? Now, for domain, if these arrows continue up this way, and that means that that graph is just going to keep going out farther and farther like this, okay? Then that means for our x values, we could have any x value that goes this way, and all the way to the left, we have negative infinity. That's the infinity symbol. We talked about that when we did interval notation. And all the way to the right is this symbol, which is positive infinity, okay? So it's kind of like a sideways 8. I have a lot of students who they'll turn their paper this way, and they'll make the number 8, put a negative there, and then when they turn it back around, it looks like a negative infinity symbol, okay? So whatever you want to do is fine, all right? Negative infinity is what we're looking at. Now I'm going to take that out so nobody gets confused why I have it there twice. Okay, so for domain, if we can have any value that goes out this way, and we can have any value that goes to the right, that means my domain is negative infinity to positive infinity, okay? Every quadratic function has the domain of negative infinity to positive infinity. Now, this is different than when we were talking about pumpkin chunking, because the domain for pumpkin chunking, it had a place where it started and a place where it ended. So if it hit the ground after, say, 5 seconds, then our domain was from 0 when it left the catapult to 5 when it hit the ground. But when we're talking about the domain of just a general quadratic function, the domain will always be negative infinity to positive infinity. Now, that's x values. Now, let's talk about range. Range is all y values. So if I look at the possible y values down here, if you will notice, this vertex right here, we don't have any y values that go below that point. So we're bounded by whatever the y value is at our vertex, which is negative 8. Now, since that is a point on the graph, we have to put a bracket around it. Remember when we did interval notation, that if it's included, that it has a bracket. So this is going to say negative 8, comma, and then how high does this graph go? Well, these arrows mean that it continues forever and ever and ever. And if I continue forever this way on my y, that means I'm going up to infinity, okay? This way is infinity, and if I continue down, that is negative infinity, okay? So up is positive infinity, down is negative infinity on your y. So if I'm continuing to go up forever, that means I go up to infinity. And remember, infinity symbols always have a parenthesis, okay? So that's how we come up with our domain and range. Now let's talk about increasing versus decreasing, okay? I want to talk about the way we read just a book. So for instance, up here, I read table, and then I say put vertex in middle. So I want you to notice that middle line. I read it from left to right. Put vertex in. We wouldn't say in vertex put, because we don't read from right to left. We read from left to right. So the same way that you read a book is the way that you read a graph. You read it from left to right. So if I start on the left side of this graph and I put my pen here, my pen is going down, which means that it is decreasing. Once I get to this vertex and I keep going, my pen is going up, which means it is increasing. Now, you always base increasing and decreasing on x values. So let's write this up here. Based on x values for increasing, decreasing. Okay? So I'm going to highlight that. Okay? And I'm going to highlight several things here. Yellow, yellow. So all of the yellow has to do with X values. The purple is based on Y values. Okay? So your Y values are purple. And notice the only thing that's a Y value is range. Okay? The only thing you base Y values on is your range. Everything else, domain, increasing and decreasing, is based on X values. Okay? So if I'm looking at the X values where I am, we said this side is decreasing to here. So what are the X values out this way? That goes out to negative infinity. So I am decreasing from negative infinity, because that's what's out this way, up to this point right here, which is the point -3. That's my vertex, -3. Then I start increasing at -3, and my X values that go this way go out to positive infinity. So for increasing, it's going to be from -3 to infinity. Now, several of you may be asking, why didn't I put brackets on the -3's? Because at this point, it stops increasing or decreasing. It doesn't do either one. So I can't say it's increasing. I can't say it's decreasing. I can just say from -3 to infinity, it increases. And from negative infinity to -3, it decreases. So these will always have parentheses. Now, if this is a little hard for you to see, let me add this in to maybe help you see it. Okay? So my vertex is here. It is at -3. All right? If I were to go this way on the X, then I'm going out to positive infinity. If I were to go to the left on the X, then that means I'm going to negative infinity. Now, when we read this graph and I went from left to right, we agreed that this side decreases. So I'm going to put a D right here for decrease. And then this side increases, so I'm going to put an I for increase. So notice what I can do now. Decrease, decrease, negative infinity to -3. That's what I put, negative infinity, -3. Where I put the I is between -3 and infinity. So increasing is -3 to infinity. So it might help some of you to draw this at the top of your graph and label it before you come up with this. I'll do that on the next example. Okay? All right, let's look at the next example. Okay? So for this one, my domain, remember domain is X values. So domain is the same for all quadratic functions. So this domain is negative infinity to positive infinity. Range. Range is Y values. Range is Y values. So if I look at my Y values, again, this down here is negative infinity, and up here is positive infinity. Okay? So I'm going down to negative infinity. That's what those arrows mean. It continues to go down. But I'm bound by my top point right here, which is at -1. Okay, that's my vertex at -1. So that means my range is going to go from negative infinity up to -1 with a bracket because -1 is a point on the graph. Okay? So negative infinity to -1. All right, now let's consider increasing and decreasing. Okay, so I'm going to do what I did in that other example and see if this helps you. So notice that right here at x equals 0, okay, x equals 0, that's where my vertex is. If I go this way, I go to positive infinity. If I go this way to the left, I go to negative infinity. Now let's read our graph from left to right. If I start here and I read my graph, I am increasing to this point. So I'm going to put an I right here. I'm increasing. If I go to this side, my pen is now decreasing. So that's going to be a D. All right, so now that makes your increasing, decreasing a little easier to see. So I'm increasing from negative infinity to 0. Negative infinity to 0. Remember, it's based on your x values, okay? And I am decreasing from 0 to infinity. 0 to infinity. All right. I would like for you to pause the video at this point and try the next two. And then after you try them, I would like for you to check them and see how you did. Okay? Okay, hopefully you have done the next two problems. So we're just basically checking to see if you did them correctly. Okay? We're just going to check and see how you did. So if I look at this first one, this was my graph. The domain, hopefully you got negative infinity to positive infinity. It's the same for every quadratic function. Now your range goes down to this point right here and doesn't go any further. And that value is negative 2. But it goes all the way up to infinity. So your range should have said, in brackets, negative 2, and then infinity with a parenthesis. Negative 2 to infinity. Okay? Then let's draw our line up here. So we're at 2. This way is infinity. And to the left is negative infinity. Okay? If we read our graph, we start on the left. My pen is decreasing on this side. So I'm going to put a D up here. My pen is increasing on this side. So I'm going to put an I here. Increasing. All right, now, this side's decreasing, this side's increasing. So when I come over here to do my increasing and decreasing, okay, you will notice that we're decreasing from negative infinity to 2. So negative infinity to 2 is decreasing, and then 2 to infinity is increasing. 2 to infinity is increasing. All right, let's consider the last one here. All right, for the last one, our domain is negative infinity to positive infinity. Our range goes up to this point right here, this little guy. But it goes all the way down to negative infinity. So we start with negative infinity, and it goes up to the y value of my vertex, which is 1.5, and that has a bracket. I also want you to notice that we always start on the left with negative, and we end with positive on the right, okay? So you follow the number line rule is what I'm saying. The number line goes from, if you had a number line, just like this right here, this number line of the x-axis, the negative's on the left, positive is on the right. You want to keep that order. So you want to start on the left and go to the right, okay? All right, now let's draw our increasing, decreasing. So I'm at 1/2. X equals 1/2. This way is infinity. This way is negative infinity. Okay? If I start on the left, my pen is increasing to this point. So I'm going to put an I here. Once I get to this vertex, if I continue, it's decreasing. So I'm going to put a D here. So we are increasing from negative infinity to 1/2. And we are decreasing from 1/2 to positive infinity. Notice again, these followed number line. Negative infinity to 1/2, 1/2 to infinity. That's the way it works its way across the number line, as you can see right here. Okay? All right, guys, let me know if you have questions.